My name is Gabriele Segalla. I am an independent research biochemist specialized in chemistry of microemulsions and colloidal systems. The numerous controversies that have recently arisen around the Pfizer-BioNTech Comirnaty vaccine have led me, out of scientific curiosity, but also from an ethical standpoint, to examine in depth several chemical, physical, and toxicological aspects, which I consider very important, regarding the composition of this medicinal preparation. The results of my scientific research have been published in Italy by the journal ND Disinfection, and also published in peer review by the American International Journal of Vaccine Theory, Practice, and Research, with the title Chemical Physical Criticality and Toxicological Potential of Lipid Nanomaterials Contained in an mRNA Vaccine. With this video, we will attempt to convey an understanding, even among non-experts of the subject, but most of all, to simplify several aspects of my investigation that are, in my opinion, fundamental and most significant. The Pfizer-BioNTech medicinal product, called Comirnaty COVID-19 mRNA BNT162b2, was placed on the European market with a conditional authorization issued by the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, on the 21st of December 2020, while the first EMA assessment report was released on the 19th of February 2021. What is it? Here you can see the qualitative-quantitative composition. First of all, let's say that it is a colloidal suspension. What is a colloidal suspension? Simplifying the concept as much as possible, I'll show you an example. This is a suspension which we chemists define as isotropic, that is to say, homogeneous, of solid particles that are suspended homogeneously throughout the liquid mass. We can see in the entire liquid phase, in all directions, the homogeneity of this suspension. When, on the other hand, the colloidal suspension loses its stability, phenomena occur that are described in chemistry under the category of coalescence. What does this mean? It is that phenomenon occurring after a loss of stability of the suspension, by which the particles dispersed in the colloidal suspension join each other, begin to aggregate and agglomerate, giving rise to the formation of larger particles, that is to say, of aggregates. And this is the phenomenon that you see represented in this slide. In the suspension that was previously homogeneous, you notice now the appearance of particles. It is not homogeneous anymore. These aggregates, these larger droplets of various sizes, which you can observe, are in fact the aggregates and agglomerates resulting from the loss of stability of the colloidal suspension. The formulation of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Here is the qualitative-quantitative composition of the medicinal preparation. You can see, first on the list, the active ingredient. that is to say, the mRNA strand, called with the code name BNT162B2. It is the ingredient that will lead to the codification of the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 in the cell of the host organism. Then we notice four components, which are lipids, the so-called functional lipids. That is, those substances that have a particular importance for the formation, the structuring, as we will see later, of the nanoparticles that are created and which incorporate the active component, the mRNA. Two of these are functional lipids. The other two are structural lipids, which therefore participate in the structuring of the nanomaterial that will then be formed. But let's focus for a moment on the first two, ALC0315 and ALC0159, because they are substances that have never been registered in pharmacopoeia, and so we can say they are totally unknown. They are defined novel excipients by the EMA. And it must be underlined that they have never been used before in a medicinal preparation. Then we note the presence of four other components, which constitute the so-called pH buffer. That is to say, that set of substances that serve to maintain the pH of the whole composition at a value as close as possible to the physiological value of the human organism, which is 7.4. These components of the pH buffer are, as you can see, electrolytic components. What does electrolyte mean? An electrolyte is a substance which, in aqueous solution, undergoes the division into ions, that is to say, in ionic compounds, electrically charged, and therefore able to conduct electric current. Electrolyte, as the etymology of the term indicates, is a substance capable of conducting electricity. Water, for example, which in the absence of electrolytes would not conduct electricity, instead, with the presence of these ionic compounds, is able to conduct electricity. In the formulation we are considering, the electrolytes are made of inorganic salts, that is, inorganic minerals. At this point, a question arises. The Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA vaccine is made of lipid nanoparticles. What are they? Let's try to schematize, to simplify everything. The typical structure of such a nanoparticle is quite complex. You can see it represented in this slide. It has an envelope that is composed of and held together by those structural functional lipids mentioned before. Within this envelope, there is the mRNA strand that should be conveyed inside the host cell, etc., etc. How could we represent the complexity of this structure so as to make it very easy to understand? First of all, let's clarify the terminology that we will be using. First of all, the nanometric dimension. What is meant by nanometer? A nanometer is an extremely microscopic measurement. A nanometer corresponds to a billionth of a meter, or a millionth of a millimeter. We are therefore talking about a measure tens of thousands of times smaller than the diameter of a human hair.
Bene, allora qui avremo come rappresentazione schematica, abbiamo pensato di...
To schematize, we could compare it to a bicycle.
Immaginate una bicicletta, sempre ovviamente...
Imagine a bicycle, obviously nanometric in size, whose length in this case is less than 100 nanometers. And the frame of this bicycle is made up of those functional and structural lipids that we saw before in the composition of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. You see here the ALC 0315, which is the most important, and the ALC 0159. The two functional lipids, and the other two structural lipids. Well, the nanobicycle is guided by, or more exactly, it incorporates in itself the mRNA strand, which constitutes the real cyclist, the thing which must be conveyed, and which is hooked to the bicycle thanks to its negative charge. In other words, the fact that the mRNA strand is negatively charged allows a better association, a better connection to the positively charged nanobicycle. Once completed the whole pattern of the nanobicycle, our bike is now able to run thanks to all of its components. Remember that the purpose of all this is to convey the cyclist, the mRNA, inside the host cell. Once inside the host cell, the nanobicycle, having reached its final destination, gives rise, after the release of the mRNA, to the coding of the component of SARS-CoV-2 known as spike protein. Another extremely important parameter in this representation is what is called the zeta potential. The concept of zeta potential could be compared to the pressure of the tires of the nanobicycle. If the tire pressure is excessive, then the zeta potential is too high. The tires could explode, and therefore the bicycle would not function anymore. If the zeta potential is too low, the tires are too deflated, and also in this case, the bicycle would no longer be able to carry out its task, which is to say, to convey the mRNA, etc., etc. Another extremely important parameter is that of the bicycle track. The track in this case is regulated by the pH, that is to say, by the buffer that guarantees a certain pH value corresponding to the physiological pH of the human organism, which is 7.4. Well, this positive charge of the nanobicycle, however, has been reported and is known as having high toxicity, as we can read here. Unfortunately for liposomes, which are other forms of nanomaterials, a little larger than the lipid nanoparticles we are talking about, and for lipid nanoparticles, Elevated toxicity has been reported, which can be a problem for the application of such preparations as pharmaceutical products. Well, who says so? Who says this? BioNTech itself says this. The very manufacturer of the vaccine of Pfizer-BioNTech. In a patent granted on November the 26th, 2019, that is to say, just over a year before the authorization granted by the EMA. The manufacturer of this composition, a year earlier, in one of his patents, declared that that preparation with that structure was not indicated, was not suitable for use as a pharmaceutical product. What would happen if I added a pH buffer containing electrolytes to a cationic nanoparticle system, such as the one we've been talking about?
Innanzitutto specifichiamo che nella nostra schematizzazione, nella nostra rappresentazione,
well, first of all, for the purpose of our schematization, we can represent an electrolyte as a nail that has a positively charged head and negatively charged tip. What happens if I throw these nails, representing the components of the PBS buffer, which is the buffer used by Pfizer-BioNTech, on the cycle track where nanobicycles are transiting, the track that had been regulated on a physiological pH, as we said, etc.? What can happen to the nanobikes on the track traveling toward the inoculation? Well, some nanobicycles may very well avoid the nails. But suppose that one of these nanobicycles runs over a nail. Well, what would happen? What would happen is simply that the zeta potential, symbolized by the nanobicycle's tire pressure, would immediately crash. The nanobike running over the nail would get its tires flattened and ruined. It would fall apart. But you say, it's only one nanobicycle. No big deal. However, we must consider that billions of other nanobicycles are traveling on that cycle track, some of which could very well collide with the nanobicycle that is broken down and lead to the formation of clusters of various sizes of nanobicycles. That is, agglomerations if they are larger, or aggregations if they are smaller. This is confirmed as well by what you can read here in this slide. In the presence of the pH buffer called PBS, the one used by Pfizer-BioNTech, lipid nanoparticles with a positive charge ratio, like those we have seen, form larger particles, which is to say, aggregations and agglomerations. As a consequence, the whole composition loses its homogeneity. And who says that? It is said once again by BioNTech, the manufacturer itself. in the same patent granted 1 year earlier, on November the 26th, 2019. They say that using that pH buffer containing those electrolytes, what we have just said happens. Larger particles are formed. And what can happen then if this composition is administered parenterally? That is, in this case, intramuscularly. That is, through an intramuscular inoculation. Let's imagine that this is a highway. We will call it the parenteral highway. The transit for bikes should be forbidden. It's not a bike track. And so what if that composition, say, what if that group of nanobicycles was to run on this highway? Well, it is easy to imagine, in the presence of those nails, they would immediately cause accidents of the kind that we have defined: aggregations, agglomerations, flocculations, which are just more serious precipitation phenomena, as they are actual flakes of various particulates, coalescences, coagulations, and phase separations. A bit like what happens with rancid milk, where the two phases separate. The fat phase separates from the aqueous phase. And this is also confirmed by what you read here. The use of a pH buffer, often necessary for pharmaceutical applications, and the presence of ionic compounds can lead to aggregation of lipid nanoparticles, which makes them unsuitable for parenteral application to patients. They literally state that they are unsuitable for applications such as the intramuscular inoculation of a vaccine. Who says that? Once again, BioNTech, the manufacturer itself, in the same patent dated November the 26th, 2019, that is to say, 1 year before the authorization granted by the EMA to market the vaccine produced, manufactured by Pfizer-BioNTech. And we also read, in the presence of the pH buffer called PBS, the same effect, which is to say the formation of these aggregations, these agglomerations, these flocculations, these coagulations, is more prominent. Lipid nanoparticles with a positive charge ratio form larger particles. This is what BioNTech says in the same patent 1 year before the authorization was granted. Well now, to sum up, we have a patent granted on November the 26th, 2019 to BioNTech. In this patent, several principles are asserted. The different characteristics that a preparation intended for immunotherapy, that is, vaccination, must have. What is asserted in this patent? Substantially, we read that an mRNA-based composition intended for immunotherapy, 1. should not contain in its formulation an ionic buffer such as PBS in order to prevent phenomena of aggregation, agglomeration, flocculation of lipid nanoparticles with all the toxicological consequences that we have hypothesized. 2. should not contain in its formulation ionic compounds such as sodium chloride, present in the composition of the Pfizer-BioNTech medicinal preparation in order to prevent aggregation, agglomeration, flocculation of lipid nanoparticles with all the related toxicological consequences. 3. It should not be injected parenterally due to its instability when it is in the physiological conditions of the extracellular district. This, I repeat, is stated in BioNTech's 2019 patent. A little over a year later, BioNTech was granted a conditional marketing authorization for a preparation, namely the medicinal preparation Comirnaty PBS sucrose by Pfizer-BioNTech, which 1. Contains an ionic buffer such as PBS based on inorganic electrolytes that may promote the phenomena of aggregation, agglomeration, flocculation of lipid nanoparticles with all the related toxicological consequences. 2. Contains ionic compounds such as sodium chloride, which may promote the phenomena of aggregation, agglomeration, flocculation of lipid nanoparticles with all the related toxicological consequences. 3. It is inoculated parenterally, with the risk of causing instability of the composition when it is placed after inoculation in the physiological conditions of the extracellular district. In other words, on one hand, we have a patent of the manufacturer BioNTech entitled RNA Formulation for Immunotherapy, containing very strict and specific indications and recommendations such as avoid electrolytes. Avoid adding electrolytic ionic compounds into the composition of a vaccine based on mRNA and lipid nanomaterials. On the other hand, we have a composition authorized by the EMA on December the 21st, 2020, which says, everything okay, nothing to object about the presence of electrolytes. And furthermore, in the patent dated November the 26th, 2019 of BioNTech, it is asserted that type of composition is not suitable for intramuscular inoculation. In the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, authorized by the EMA on December the 21st, 2020, it is said that it is suitable for intramuscular inoculation. Among the main adverse effects that can be associated to the formation of aggregations, coagulations, agglomerations, flocculations, coalescences within the host organism, in the organism in which this composition is inoculated, it is plausible to contemplate and enumerate the following reactions that epidemiological statistics are confirming. You find, for example, allergic or anaphylactic reactions, cardiovascular disorders, myocarditis, pericarditis, thrombotic phenomena, ischemic stroke, paresthesias, sudden metastases, autoimmune diseases, skin reactions of various kinds, alterations of the menstrual cycle, activation of herpes zoster, neurological and hepatic diseases, eye diseases, thyroid diseases, sudden deaths, etc. One wonders, why? Why a formulation that is obviously, admittedly unstable, and therefore careless, incautious, dangerous, imperfect, is marketed and administered to billions of individuals around the world? How is this possible? Why? We will try to understand some more, moving on. Now, let's find out how Pfizer-BioNTech tried to solve the obvious stability problems of its medicinal preparation. In other words, how to solve the transport and storage problems of a thermodynamically unstable colloidal system. Easy. Brilliant idea. Bring it to subglacial temperatures. That is to say, 72 degrees below 0 centigrade. Here the reason for the freezing. The medicinal preparation called Comirnaty by Pfizer-BioNTech is an aqueous suspension of thermodynamically unstable lipid nanomaterials, which must be frozen at 72 degrees below 0 centigrade. This suspension, after the thawing and dilution phases, becomes the finished product intramuscularly injectable. Once it arrives at its destination, the vial of the concentrated vaccine must be thawed, that is to say, brought back to room temperature of about 25 degrees centigrade. Once brought to room temperature, the vaccinating operator will have to proceed with a further phase, the dilution phase of the concentrate. The dilution phase is done by adding to the vial a 0.9% solution of sodium chloride, which means, once again, another electrolyte. After completing the dilution phase, there is the mixing phase, which must take place according to precise instructions of the manufacturer, namely, gently invert the diluted dispersion 10 times. Do not shake. Stirred, but not shaken. The diluted vaccine should appear as a whitish dispersion, with no visible particles. If particles are present, or if discoloration occurs, do not use the diluted vaccine. At this point, finally, the phase of intramuscular inoculation can take place, during which the colloidal suspension, already destabilized by the addition of another dose of electrolyte solution, undergoes a further thermal shock, passing from room temperature to the temperature of 37 degrees centigrade of the human body, for a total temperature difference of 109 degrees centigrade. The phases of thawing and dilution therefore imply, on the one hand, a heating, and on the other, the addition of an extra amount of an electrolyte. It is important to note that this can increase the risks of further destabilization of the colloidal structure. That is, the well-known coagulation phenomena, as reported in the Treccani Encyclopedia, where you find the definition of coagulation in chemistry. Coagulation can be caused by heating, but, above all, by the action of chemical agents, in particular electrolytes, that alter the ionic strength of the solution and therefore further destabilize it. On the 18th of October 2021, the EMA announced on its website that the CHMP, Committee for Human Medicinal Products in Europe, had approved a ready-to-use formulation of Comirnaty. This formulation does not require dilution prior to administration. It will be available in packs of 10 vials, 60 doses, can be stored at 2 to 8 degrees centigrade for up to 10 weeks. According to the singular announcement, the new Comirnaty formulation, ready for inoculation, no longer requires dilution, with obvious advantages of storage, transport, and logistics. And on page 14 of the EMA report of the 14th of October 2021, the new formulation is revealed, and with it, some details that tend to prove, both on a chemical, physical, and toxicological level, the evident instability and potential danger of the previous composition. In fact, in the new formulation of Comirnaty, called tris-sucrose finished product, containing the same active chemically modified mRNA, etc., etc., the same functional lipids, the same supporting excipients at the same concentrations, all the electrolytes that were present in the previous electrolytic formulation have disappeared. In the occasion, the original product was renamed as PBS sucrose, where PBS stands for phosphate buffered saline. And on page 15 of the report, it is clear that the original Comirnaty PBS sucrose vaccine, injected in billions of doses worldwide, has been modified, not only for greater ease of handling, for logistical and storage reasons, but also, first and foremost, to improve its stability. This, finally, is the first evident admission, although partial and swamped by logistical justifications. It is the first clear admission that the previous PBS sucrose electrolytic version was not sufficiently stable, and consequently presented greater toxicological risks than the non-electrolytic version tris-sucrose, later formulated by Pfizer-BioNTech and promptly authorized by the EMA. So at this point, a normal sentient human being operating within the framework of logic and having in mind the community interests would think, well, the manufacturer, Pfizer-BioNTech, although with some delay, had repented, had changed its mind, and had corrected the previous formulation. The previous imperfect, wrong, dangerous formulation was replaced with a less unstable and perhaps less dangerous composition without electrolytes. Not at all. The electrolyte version, unstable, needing dilution before inoculation, remains surprisingly on the market. Characterized by a purple cap with the instructions, dilution required for subjects aged 12 years and older, next to the new one with a gray cap, dilution not necessary, but also for subjects aged 12 years and older. Both versions are, however, authorized for marketing in Europe, always with the formula authorization subject to conditions. What is now proven and irrefutable is that the Comirnaty PBS sucrose vaccine is 1. Unstable, 2. Ineffective, 3. Insecure, and therefore it is what can be defined an imperfect medicine. And what is meant by imperfect medicine? Article 443 of the Italian Penal Code explains it to us. Anyone who holds for trade, markets, or administers defective or imperfect medicines is punished with imprisonment from 6 months to 3 years, and with a fine of not less than €103. In the notes of Article 443 of the Penal Code, the definition of imperfect medicinal product says, the medicinal product qualifies as defective or imperfect if its therapeutic efficacy is lacking or significantly diminished, as for example in cases where it has expired or there has been an error in production, or it is devoid of necessary components or contains active ingredients that are not correctly dosed.
Per concludere, possiamo semplicemente ipotizzare che i diversi fattori di rischio che abbiamo esaminato.
To conclude, we can simply presume that the several risk factors that we have examined, and that are reported in greater detail in my study, have inevitably compromised the stability, shelf life, functionality, and consequent toxicological potential of the medicinal product called Comirnaty PBS sucrose of Pfizer-BioNTech, causing a heterogeneity of adverse effects, potentially variable from batch to batch, from vial to vial, from vaccinator to vaccinator, from vaccinated subject to vaccinated subject, in a sort of ineluctable, uncontrollable, and indecipherable Russian roulette.